Welcome to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. I'm here today with our design editor, Jonathan, and a special guest star, regular artist contributor, Haley Grunloh. Welcome, Haley. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello.
Hi.
So today we've decided to do something a bit different with our podcast. We're going to pick a utopian story, read through it, and discuss our thoughts on it. So we chose to discuss Sultana's Dream by Rokia Sekawat Hossain. It was written in 1905. Sultana's Dream is considered a feminist utopia, and Rokia is one of the first women writers to do a science fiction short story. Rokia Sekawat Hossain was born 1880 and passed away in 1932. She was a Bengali writer, famous for her work on gender equality. She wrote many genres and modes, including short stories, which we're going to read today, poems, essays, novels, and satirical works. Born into a wealthy family, Hossain had relatives who were government ministers and a sister who was a popular poet. And although she married at 16, Hossain's husband was a progressive who allowed her to continue her education and who encouraged her activism. Hossain often used humor and cutting satire in her writings to push back widespread resistance to the education of women. She established the first school for Muslim girls in 1909 and founded the Islamic Women's Association. The most notable of her short stories is the one that we're talking about today, Sultana's Dream. As with much early science fiction, the story takes the form of a conte philosophique, which translates as fable of reason. And that's all I have to say about that. All right. So, Haley, start us off with a synopsis.
It starts out with this woman, Sultana, and she, in the beginning of the story, she's lounging in an easy chair in her bedroom, and she's thinking lazily about the condition of Indian womanhood, like you do. And she falls asleep, and she has a dream where she meets this other woman named Sister Sarah, who I guess is not a real person, but she's kind of like conflating her with a real person named Sister Sarah, who she knows in real life. But it's like one of those dream people where you're like, this person is my real life friend, but not really. And Sister Sarah exists in this parallel dream reality where it's like a matriarchal society where men are
like
kept...
Ladyland or something like that. Ladyland?
Ladyland is the name of this land. Yeah, and it's sort of... it's like a reverse of, I guess, what it was like to live in India at the time, where instead of like women being kept in seclusion, it's the men who have to live in seclusion, and women are in charge of everything. And it's a short story. It's basically just like explaining how this world works, and basically they're like, well, we got rid of the men and now everything is perfect. That's the thesis of this story. And she learns all this interesting stuff about like, oh, how did this happen? Because it wasn't like always like this. It was, she explains like the transition of like how they ended up in this women-led society. And then there's like some cool science fiction-y technology that they talk about that like helps them build this utopia. And then at the end, Sultana wakes up and it was all a dream. And that's pretty much it. It's not so much a story with like an arc and action and characters. Yeah. It's more like a what if kind of thought experiment.
Dialogue too. A lot of it is, exposition through dialogue. She's having this conversation. She's having this conversation with a complete stranger who she thinks is Sister Sarah, realizes that she doesn't know her at all, but keeps calling her Sister Sarah because...
Well, the lady doesn't give her a different name, so...
No, you're right, so...
I mean, what's she gonna do?
There's a lot of talk about how it came to be, and there's a lot of talk about, like, the woman science. It starts off, I think the first thing they mention is that there were 2 universities that were created, one for women and one for men, and no one took the women's university seriously. But it created the technology that was necessary to win, like, a war. There was a war between that country, between Ladyland and some neighboring kingdom.
I laugh every time I see Ladyland. Was this story originally in Bengali, or did she write it in English?
I think she would have written it originally in Bengali.
Like, I wonder if Ladyland sounds less silly in the original language.
Maybe, or
Wait, no,
I don't know.
on the top it says Sultana's Dream was originally published in the Indian Ladies magazine 1905 in English.
Oh, it was published in English.
So it was written in English. When because I did, after I read the story the first time, I did like read her Wikipedia page. And I was really interested to see that her husband was really supportive of her being educated and writing stories and being an activist. Just because in this story, there's no example of like a male ally. It's just like, oh, we got rid of the men and it's great. And that's all there is to it.
What was everyone's first impression after reading the story? Jonathan, why don't you start?
Well, I didn't like it at first, mostly because a lot of the satire went right over my head.
I feel like her sense of humor is sometimes passes me by. Like you kind of have to be looking for it. But I do think like just like reading the beginning for the second time, and like the first line is, I was lounging in an easy chair in my bedroom and thinking lazily of the condition of Indian womanhood. Like, and just like thinking about that line, and like that's what we start with. I don't know. There's something funny about that to me. I think it sets up what kind of story it is. It's kind of telling you this is what the story's agenda is, like right up front, in kind of like a tongue-in-cheek way.
Yeah, it's kind of a dry humor.
Yeah, a little bit of a dry humor.
Yeah, a lot of it was flipping around the same arguments that men would give for why the women were secluded. It was reversing the roles entirely, so you could see how silly it was, in a way.
I love the fact that it turns those stupid arguments on their head.
I think when I started reading it, if I had read this story thinking like, oh, this was written like a couple years ago, or this was written in a different culture, I would have seen it a lot differently. But since it started off reading the article saying like, okay, this was published in 1905, it's not like yesterday. This is before the whole like feminist movements of like 60s and 70s.
This was before women had the right to vote.
Yeah, and I think that if I read this and it was written within the past couple decades, or if it was written in America, I would just be like, well, this is just not saying anything new or interesting or complex, really. But knowing that it was written in 1905, like, changed my whole view of it. Because, like, she would have lived in a totally different world where, like, what if the women were in charge now? To us now, it seems just kind of like, well, cliche, and like this is a simplistic view of feminism. We know it's not that simple. I can't think of another story from this time that like would have said this.
Really, challenging the status quo, especially in India, where it was written. So they mentioned like solar power in this, which is really interesting because solar power was not taken seriously until the 1940s, well after.
That's fascinating.
So that was the nice science fiction element that I found in this story that I really enjoyed.
My favorite science fiction detail is the like streets that are like paved with moss and flowers.
Oh, and you can't hurt them by walking on them because they're street flowers.
They're sturdy street flowers. They're like they've been genetically engineered or something. I want to live in a world I don't want to live in a world where all the men are like shut in a prison, but I do want to live in a world with like street flowers.
Yeah, there are some appealing qualities to this utopia. The street flowers, the flying machine.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun things.
So what did you think about the style, the way it was written?
It is very dry, but you can definitely spot some of the humor in there if you look carefully. And I think that's a fairly common aspect of reading short stories from this period. I mean, H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator is much the same way. A lot of the humor is very, very dry.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not paying attention, like I was with my first reading of the short story, the humor can just pass right over you and it becomes straight up horror.
It's interesting, the fine line between humor and horror in that.
But yeah, having missed all of the humor in that first reading, having all the men shut away,
Mm-hmm.
it felt like, really? You want that?
It's very straightforward, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. It's very exposition heavy kind of story, which usually doesn't work, but I thought that it worked well for this story. It's a lot of telling of the history, but the world is
It's not
described through
really,
dialogue,
yeah,
which is
it's
also
not
amusing.
really like a story. Like, it's more of a thesis presented in an interesting way than it is like a story.
Yeah, I think with it being history, world building, that kind of thing, and
Mm-hmm.
with it sort of being an introduction for the narrator, it makes a lot of sense.
The Conte Philosophie. It's the
Is this
reasoned
new
fable.
genre?
It's this kind of,
Yeah, it's a
fairy
fable.
tale-like thing.
That's a good way to describe it, actually, as a fable. Like, it's not there to bring you along an adventure or like bring you along on a character's emotional journey. It's there to make a very specific point about something. And it's very short, so it can't do that many things. It's very much just explaining the world and stuff. Like, I feel like you could set a whole novel in this world and it would be very different. But this is just like, let's hear a description of a what if scenario in just a couple pages.
And a lot of it is like talking over, arguments, giving reasons.
Yeah.
I want to point out some very famous arguments that popped up in here. One of them was the lion and the elephant. Do you remember these arguments?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why men were supposed to rule was because they were stronger and their brains were bigger than women. And so therefore they must be superior, which is utter nonsense. And one of the ways they point this out in the story is the sister Sarah goes, well, a lion is stronger than a man, but lions don't rule over man. And an elephant has a bigger brain, but elephants aren't smarter. They don't rule over
I don't know. I
man.
think elephants might be smarter than us.
They're definitely smarter than us. You can tell
But
because they're not trying to rule over us.
Yeah. So one like recent science fiction story that I kept thinking about after reading this story is the book The Power by Naomi Alderman. Basically the thesis of that book, which I'm not totally on board with, but it was interesting, was that like the reason for, the patriarchy and male dominance in history and our modern day culture comes from men being physically more powerful. And so like one day all the women get a superpower that makes them more physically imposing than men. They get these like electrical zapping people powers. So basically gives all women have the power to physically overpower men. And sort of the thesis of this book was, okay, that happens, and then like a couple millennia later, we have like basically the exact same gender inequality, but it's like it's women on the top and men underneath, basically like it is in this story. And sort of the point being like, okay, so the only reason men have been in charge in all these cultures throughout history is because they're like a little bit stronger physically than women. And it was a really interesting book, but I don't totally buy it. I thought like reading this story, and she has the bit, she's like, yeah, well, like, the lions aren't in charge, even though they're stronger. I was kind of like, yeah, like there's more to it than just your ability to beat someone up on an individual level doesn't totally explain like all the gender politics that are baked into society and everything. Like, I don't think it all comes from a little physical difference. I always wonder, like, because this story doesn't really touch on anything like men would maybe not be so excited about this, and like they would be questioning it, and like women would be questioning it. There would be, men's rights activists which, like, in our world today are a weird, hilarious joke. But in a world like this, that would be the real issue.
Well, so I liked how it says that, the men volunteered for this kind of servitude. They kind of let the women take over and use the sentimental women's science to win the war. But in doing so, they voluntarily yielded their power.
It is interesting. But then also you think about, like, the real world, and there are, like, women who are against feminism. They've bought into these patriarchal systems just as much as men have, maybe in a different way, but
Definitely. So I was really struck by the metaphor of the garden. Everything is mentioned as being like this giant, wonderful garden. There's street flowers, which you can walk on.
my favorite part.
Yeah, it really is great. So what do you think the metaphor of the garden is?
Yeah, I mean, it's repeated quite a bit.
It reminds me a bit of like the kinds of gardens you would normally see if you went to palaces or castles, places where kings and nobles would normally live apart from society, but they still
like
had a little bit of nature so that they could at least pretend to be connected with the rest of the world, even though they were usually more shut off from it.
Interesting.
They said that Sultana would go for like midnight walks with Sister Sarah when she was younger in the garden. And that was like the one place they were safe from being looked at by men, which is against the Purdah tradition. So I wonder if, the garden expanding into the entire world is kind of this metaphor for women being able to expand into this entire world. The world is safe. This kingdom is safe. It's a giant garden.
That is, like, a really fascinating way to look at this story, I think. Okay, I might be like, because there's also the bit where their list of relatives they're allowed to hang out with is a lot bigger. Again, like, I don't know a lot about this culture and, like, what and how it works. I just know what's in this story. But she talks a little bit about you're only allowed to like hang out with the men who are in your list of sacred relations.
Yeah.
She says our circle of sacred relations is very limited. Even first cousins are not sacred. And the other lady is like, but ours is very large. A distant cousin is as sacred as a brother. So it's like they've expanded the list of like men who they're safe with, to like go back to the garden metaphor of like it's like, yeah, I agree. That's my point.
I think the garden's probably also like metaphorical of life in general and knowledge, enlightenment. And I keep wanting to connect it to the Garden of Eden.
Did you say she was Muslim?
The Garden of Eden is actually part of Islam. So
I think she was Hindu. They follow the same law of Purdah. Yeah.
I feel like maybe it was like something she was published in like an Islamic magazine or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But okay. So she's not. So the Garden of Eden story is not in her particular.
It might have been, but I somehow think that
probably
it's less
wouldn't
likely
be the
than I
first
want it
thing
to be.
she was thinking of. Yeah.
But it's definitely something you make a connection to.
Yeah. Well, I guess like gardens, maybe, aside from the Garden of Eden story, would be associated with peace and harmony.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Kind of think a little bit of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say one of my favorite bits in the story, besides the street flowers, was when Sister Sarah is saying, like, oh, we only work 2 hours a day, or whatever. And Sultana is like, but, like, how do you get all the work done? Because, like, in my world, the men, like, they work all day long. And Sister Sarah is like, they actually just, like, waste most of their time, like, dicking around.
Oh, smoking.
And only do 2 hours of work anyway. So who do you think, like, this was published in the Indian Ladies magazine. So I guess, like, her audience, well, I don't know if, like, when she wrote it, she was thinking, like, of a specific audience. But I'm assuming that the readers of the Indian Ladies magazine would have mostly been women. How much do you think she was intending this story to, like, be for women to read and like is like sending a message to other women, versus were men supposed to read this and learn something from it?
I think it's definitely focused on empowering women. So it's definitely a more women related audience, I would
Like
think.
women were supposed to read this and say like, hey, wait a minute.
It was supposed to plant the seeds of doubt, make people ask questions, and realize how silly some of these arguments are that people have been using for generations.
So I'm curious, you might not actually have an answer for me, but like what did people think of this story when it came out in 1905 in the Indian Ladies magazine? People like it? Did people think it was stupid? Were people angry about it? Were people just like, aha, how whimsical? I'm really curious.
It was popular. It was one of her
Yeah.
most well-known stories, so it achieved recognition in her lifetime. So here's an important question for both of you. If you were to design a feminist utopia, what would it look like?
Oh, that's a great question.
One thing I have yet to see, mostly because a lot of sci-fi tends to focus on, the adventures in outer space, or whatever the future setting is. I would like to see, examples of men being happy as the one staying at home. Because, for me, it would be a balance.
Yeah.
You would have men who are happy to stay at home and raise the kids, while the woman goes out to, be the breadwinner. And partly because I have some friends who are actually like that, so.
That's a good point. I feel like my feminist utopia would probably look pretty similar to this, except the men would have a bit more equal rights. I want there to be street flowers, and I want there to be this beautiful garden. I only want to work 2 hours a day. That's the real utopia part. But I feel like, more balance. I feel like it has to be a balance in between. But I do like this idea of, there's not really hunger. They have water taken care of. They have their defenses and such. And it's a really peaceful pro-knowledge culture they've created. And I think pro-knowledge is also super important. What about you, Haley?
I'm not going to add too much more. I kind of agree. Like, this world in Sultana's dream is pretty sweet. But I think, like, the main thing that would make it a real utopia is, instead of just like shutting the men away, if it was like a society that just treated them as equals. And also, I think the one thing I would add to what Tristan, what you just said, is I think like nowadays, like we have push for like queer rights, and we don't have to like stick to the gender binary and everything. And I think it would be a world where people who don't fit into male or female would not face all this, trauma and persecution about that. So it would be like we would have the privilege, like, sort of not to think about gender at all, and or not treat it as something more important than it is. I definitely want the street flowers. I wonder if, since the writer of this story, since she lived in a world that was much more strictly patriarchal than like the one that we're in now, I wonder if to her, like, the idea, it might have seemed like the only way to liberate women would be to get rid of the men. Because, like, the world that we live in now, like, we're much closer to having, women. We have tons of gender inequality still, but on the whole, there's way more freedom, way more options and things for women. And I wonder if, like, to her, like, she wouldn't really have thought, like, she would have thought, like, we have to solve the problem of the men controlling everything by getting rid of them. And she maybe, like, wouldn't have immediately thought, oh, we can just all be fine, because she lives in a world where men are actively, limiting women's mobility and freedom and everything. To us, it seems like, well, obviously we can all be equal. But maybe to her that seemed like more of a problem to solve.
It's definitely something that came into play. And some of it was probably exaggerated a bit, but some of it was also, serious speculation. How do you solve this problem?
like we said in the beginning, her husband was like a real ally
Yeah.
to her getting an education and everything. So it wasn't like she like never met a man who wanted her to look for a better world, but it would have been different. Like her feelings about this would have been very different from ours.
Absolutely, yeah. I wonder if that's also the reason for putting, all of these men into like repressing them, so leaving them in their home in like the center apartments where they can't leave. If such a response was because she thought that if men were given some freedoms, there would always be the chance for them to regress back to the status quo, which she really was not happy with.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
Well, they did ask that. Like the general wanted his position back after the war, and the queen said, well, there's no danger anymore, so there's no need for a war. So why don't you just relax and rest and take it easy and we'll handle it? And they agreed.
Just, thinking about that, I'm sure in this world there's plenty of men who are perfectly content with their lives, but you can't put everybody, like not everybody is going to be content with the same things. And like, I'm sure in the real world, there are women who are like in similar cultures who are, kept in seclusion and who are content with the world that they live in. But that's not going to be true of every single person. There's always going to be people who question things and who, want to shake things up.
So, do any of you have any questions about Sultana's dream you want to discuss?
How did you feel about it was all just a dream?
But that's what the story is.
I think so. I normally don't like endings like that, but I can see why there were reasons it was what it was. If it's just a dream, then you can't really hold people responsible for radicalizing, putting out all these radical ideas. It's just a theory. It's just a supposed thing. So you get in a little less trouble that way. And also, I think it was the best way to really explore. And do we know that it's a dream? We assume that it's a dream, but it never says anywhere that she was dreaming.
I think that ending it with like, and then she woke up, I think mainly it's just a way to keep the story from getting bigger and more complicated than it is. Like the point of the story, like it's very short, is to just sort of say like, well, what if there was this world? Here's a little bit of how it works. We don't want to get into like, is she in a parallel universe? How does she get back or anything like that? Like that's not what this story is about at all.
I also want to just point this out. Like the second line is, I am not sure whether I dozed off or not, but as far as I remember, I was wide awake. And I think when she says she woke up at the end, it's not just that she physically woke up. I think it's a metaphor that, her eyes were open.
Yeah, I guess she doesn't actually say I woke up. She says, I somehow slipped down and the fall startled me out of my dream. And on opening my eyes, I found myself in my bedroom.
Ah, yes. I think the opening the eyes is kind of,
seems, yeah, she opens her eyes.
Mm.
She was startled out of her dream. So I think it's just a little device to stop the story from getting more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah, definitely. It's one way of keeping things short. All right, so I think that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Haley. It was great to have you.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
All right, so I will see everyone on our next podcast next month. Cheers.